Alignment Garden, February 19th. In this video, I thought I'd just take you through the yard, show you what the trees look like after about 60 hours of my time over the last few weeks pruning them up. If you're not familiar with my channel, I garden out in the Phoenix, Arizona area, USDA climate zone 9B. I'm on half an acre, and I have a number of fruit trees here that are very densely planted. So when I talk to you about pruning, it's going to be from the standpoint of more of a backyard, orchard style format. This is not necessarily what you do if you have acreage and a lot of space. I need to keep my trees compact based on how I have them planted out, which is very dense. I don't have a huge amount of space in between my trees, as you'll find. Some of them are as close as a couple feet. You know, others as far apart as 10 feet. But on average, we're looking at 5 to 8 feet apart. So it's important to come through and prune every year for fruit production, as well as keeping that size manageable. Starting off, here's my Anna apple tree. You can see that it's actually got a flush of leaves on it, and that's not new growth, but growth left over from last year, because this tree did not actually hit dormancy. We've had a very warm winter, and so that did not force this to drop its leaves, as it would in a cooler climate. You can see that it's actually flowering at this point, and I was able to prune it before it headed into the flowering stage. Especially when we have a warm winter, January is probably your best time to prune. We see our coldest temperatures in that month. February, we can start to warm up quite a bit, get into the 70s and even 80s. So what I've done with this tree is taken about 30% of the growth off. The cuts were to help support airflow and room for new growth, but also to try to preserve as much fruiting wood as possible so I get a good harvest. So you can see a number of fruit spurs kind of in the middle of the tree. I've left my main scaffolds, and it's topping out around 8 feet. So I do head this back. Apple trees are not as aggressive here as, say, a fig tree, but you still want to definitely prune them every year to help control the size. Keep your fruit within easy picking reach. Let's talk a little bit about fig trees. Similar to mulberries, fig trees put on so much growth in a year that you're pretty safe, and it's actually best if you aggressively prune each winter. One thing you'll have to be careful if you're like me and you multi-graft your fig trees is marking where that graft union is so you don't accidentally lop off your grafted variety. So for example, I've got this Atriano in ground right here, and you can see that I've really cut it back. Look at prior videos, this thing gets huge every year, goes way up to about 15-16 feet tall. This is a 6-foot block wall, and you can see I pruned it back to about 4 feet in height. I've taken off most of the limbs. So a couple things with the multi-grafted tree. One is you're going to want to mark where your graft union is. On mine, my graft union is right here. I certainly painted beyond that, but that gives me a good idea of where not to cut. Just use some tree trunk paint. White works fine. You want something that's distinguishable from, the brown bark, so I wouldn't suggest going with the brown colored paint. The other thing I'm starting to do is use an oil-based Sharpie pen, again in a color that's distinguishable, to mark the variety. So we can see this one is I-258. I've got a Joe's Jersey graft here. You can see this branch is so thick now, those metal tags really aren't going to be a good thing to put on there, because what can happen is as the season progresses and that branch thickens up, it can actually enlarge to the point where the metal is now getting embedded in the bark and damaging it. So by writing it I'm not damaging the tree or potentially exposing the tree to damage. While I'm here, I want to also mention this graft. This is a Caserani that I put on last year, and you can see that it really didn't do much. And that's because whenever you graft onto a vigorous rootstock, if you don't keep that rootstock in check, it's going to outcompete the graft. And that's exactly what happened here. So the rootstock, this Apricot, pushed its own branch up. You can see how thick it was. And so the tree put all its energy into supporting this and not this. So when I'm pruning a fig tree, not only am I looking for, shaping and all, but I'm also taking out any kind of rootstock that could be impeding with the growth of the grafted variety. So the only branch that I've left on of the rootstock is this one back here. And this also is rootstock, which I've used to put a graft on up here. This is also a great time to be grafting your fig trees. We're warm enough now that a lot of the fig trees are starting to swell their buds and will be pushing growth. That's the perfect time of the year to graft. So just put this on a few days back. Here's another fig tree example. This one has no grafts on it. This is an LSU Scots Yellow, and you can see that I've really severely pruned it. We've got just one main trunk here, and I've got 4 branches, coming off the sides here. And while that might seem like too severe of a cut, if I don't do this and cut these down real low, then they're going to be producing fruit way up here, and I won't be able to reach it. So I do this every year, bring this down to where it's no taller than, 5 feet. Just showing you some more examples of fig trees. This one happens to be a little taller just because with this tree I grafted a little high. I try to avoid that, but this Nixon piece I grafted up high. So in order to preserve this branch and get some potential Breba fruit off the old wood, I left it pretty tall. It's about 5.5 feet. Just giving you some more examples. This is a multi-grafted LSU Purple. And we've got a Sucrete here, St. Martin graft, Red Lebanese Becca Valley, and Cochio Verdial. So you can see that I haven't left any of the rootstock. It's all cleaned off so that all the energy can be put into those grafts. This is my Pistilier. This is a dwarf fig tree. I don't prune this as hard because it's not as vigorous as my other fruit trees. So with this one, I just thinned out the branches a bit, but left more wood on this tree than my other ones. Another example of a Frankenfig or multi-grafted fig tree. This is an in-ground Texas everbearing. Every single branch on this tree holds a graft. Again, in order for all these grafts to do well, I can't have rootstock competing. In order to support the grafts, I try to always graft as low as possible to minimize the amount of rootstock that could push, new branches and compete. But with this tree, you can see some of the grafts are up high. I just didn't have any other alternative. This Genovese Nero AF is up high. So in cases like this, I still prune it back pretty heavy. I mean, this Genovese Nero was 12 feet up in the air. So I cut a lot of this tree off to sell cuttings this year, as well as rooting them. And this is all that I'm leaving behind on this. So again, each of these grafts are marked where the union is, so I know where not to cut. And then I've written down the variety on the bark itself, so I don't lose track. Okay, looking at another multi-grafted fig tree. This one is a Black Mission. I really severely pruned it this year because I'm at a point now after 5 years with some of these grafts being on as long as 3 years and not getting decent fruit off of them, decided to go ahead and cut them off. So it gave me an opportunity to really shape the tree at this point. This tree has not been that vigorous, definitely not as good as the Texas Everbearing, and I think it's because its energy was so divided carrying a bunch of grafts. I suspect it's going to do a lot better this year now that I've really thinned it out. I don't have too many grafts at this point now. You can see on pruning, all of my trees have a single trunk. I just prefer that style. And then I've got my main scaffolds here. So you can see I really only have 3 branches coming out of this tree now. Also, this gets pretty brutally assaulted from the sun. So the other thing that I've done this year is applied tree trunk paint to the side of this tree that's facing the sun. If you see a lot of scald on your bark, this time of the year is a great time to go ahead and take care of that problem. You have more visibility than you'll ever have for the rest of the year. Once this thing starts to flush out with growth, it's pretty difficult to get in there and paint. So you can see these also have a few new grafts. I have a colleague at work that has a white Madeira, did a trade with him, so I've got that here. This is a white Madeira graft. Have another white Madeira graft up here. It's starting to push. Coldedama Blanca Negra up there. A new one, this is the Bergen Unknown. That's actually grafted to a graft. This is Black Greek. Have a Figo Prado there. This is a Black Acacia, Matoso Prado. And then another graft that I just did of Suati. It's also getting a lot of heat right now, a lot of sun with the weather we've been having, and starting to push. So my graft should actually start breaking bud probably in the next week. I'll share with you what I did with this white Persian mulberry. You can see that this one's a little bit different in that I allowed it to branch taller. So this branch here is coming up around 4 feet, 4.5 feet. You know, this one's 5 to 6 feet at this point. And then I've got a second tier up here that's even taller. I was pushing more towards 10 feet. And the reason for that is this tree serves for shade. If I were to cut it down, you know, to 2 feet tall, that's great for being able to get fruit low down, but it's not going to give me that much shade if I cut it down that low every year. I want that shade aspect going for me. I keep it higher off the ground, but you can see with the limbs, the main scaffold limbs, I've lopped off with the chainsaw actually, because they're so thick, the diameter of these, and really did what they call pollarding. So I just left basically the skeleton. This was definitely a heavy prune for me. I actually pruned off a third tier that was even higher. It was in this vicinity. This structure will still give me nice shade, but it won't be as difficult to maintain or trim back next year. So every other year or so, I'll do something as severe as this, where I'll really take it down to kind of bare bones level, where I just have, you know, my scaffold branches and my main trunk, nothing else. This does somewhat hurt your fruit production. You're not going to get as much when you cut this severely because now the tree has to put a lot of growth on, you know, for its canopy. Take a look at some of the other mulberries in my yard. This is an Illinois everbearing, has been in the ground for 5 years at this point. Took a similar stance on this one, where really cutting things back to main scaffold limbs, doing that pollarding style. I did leave some of the fruiting spurs on this, just so that I could get a little bit more fruit set on it. With keeping this short, it's not going to be as top heavy with growth, so less of a chance of limbs breaking in storms. This is my last mulberry. This is the Shangri-La. Had cut this very short when I first planted it, and really establishing those scaffold limbs down low. This tree is not going to get as huge as the others. It's a little bit more compact of a variety. I left a few more spurs on here, but definitely opened up that center just like the other trees. Cut out all of the branches that go straight up vertically and left the branches that are bowing out, because I want this to provide some shade canopy as well, not just fruit. Mulberries are notorious for growing just vertically. And most of us don't want a totem pole, we want a shade canopy. So the other aspect with pruning, of course, is shaping. And that's what I attempted to do here by leaving all of these kind of outer branches to bow. It's my Katy apricot with this tree, really just heading it back. You can see the fruiting spurs are not any taller than around 8 feet. I also removed a lot of branches in the interior, opening this up. Again, you can see a vase structure. And this tree was pruned low early on. This was shaped from the time when I first put it into the ground to branch low. So you can see an open center, and that main trunk to where it starts branching off, that's only about a foot off the ground. So it scaffolds very low to the ground, really packs in the fruit. I get hundreds of apricots every year off this tree. And with the spacing in my yard, it really is necessary to kind of control these trees. I don't have a huge amount of space in between. You know, from that trunk to the, we're talking probably 4 feet across, 4.5 feet maybe. So to accommodate all these trees, I need to keep them more compact. Almond trees require a little bit of a different pruning strategy. Fruit does not set on new wood, but actually sets on the mature wood. So you want to leave as much wood as possible to increase your fruit set. So really with this one, I did more of a light pruning. I still took out a lot of crossing branches, gave more open air in the center of this tree, but tried to preserve what I could, and then headed it back again to about a 10-foot height. Almond trees, unlike a fig tree or a mulberry tree, really don't put on a huge amount of growth during the year, so you don't need to prune them back as heavy as you would those other trees. Just really quick on my Arbequina olive. It's been in the ground for 5 years now. It is a dwarf, but it was getting pretty tall and putting pressure on that arbor there and just getting a little unruly. So I went and headed it back so it's not as tall. Cut out a lot of the lower limbs so that it looks like a tree instead of a bush. And just thinned it out a little bit so it wasn't as tight with foliage. Again, more air, light penetration. This is a low chill peach that I got from Reed at RSI, planted last fall. And you can see really the only thing that I did here was topped it fairly low. So about 2 feet off the ground. And what that'll do is encourage the trunk to thicken up. It'll encourage lower branching, because ultimately I want this tree to be somewhat compact and short I don't want this to be a huge tree. So I'm training it young to support that structure. Real quick, this is my Fuji apple tree. It was quite a large tree, and you can now see it's a little stump. And that's because it has produced very low volumes of fruit. It's supposed to be self-fertile, but requires higher chill hours. Never really gotten a lot of fruit off of it. So experimenting this year, completely chopped it back to do some top working. So like I've advised with grafting, you're going to want to graft as low as possible, and you don't want anything competing. So you can see I've left nothing of the rootstock as far as branching, just that main trunk. So this is a cane apple here. These are all low chill varieties that I down here. This one is called White Winter Pearmain. This pear is the Crips Pink. And this last pear are Winter Banana. So just opted to get some scions from Fruitwood Nursery. See how these work out. They're all much lower chill hours, in the neighborhood of 200 hours versus Fuji that's 400. This is a wonderful variety. It's been in ground for 8 years, and a couple years ago I completely top worked it, so cut the plant down to probably less than 12 inches from the ground level, and then put on new varieties, soft-seeded varieties. What you can also see is I've got some grafts going here as well. So all the grafts that you can see up here that are now mature after 2 years, they all started like this. Tiny little rind-bark approach grafts. The right time of the year to do grafting on your pomegranate is right before bud break. You can see this tree is just starting to break bud, and the scions are doing the same. So these are actually pink ice, variety that I'm looking forward to for sure. And my approach with pruning this tree this year was really shaping it. So got rid of a lot of crossing branches, really selected the best main scaffolds for each of these grafts, and really just balancing the tree or the bush. Last year I didn't mess with it, really just allowed it to grow so that I had opportunity to pick the best limbs the next year that would help support good fruit set. Pomegranates in general you can prune pretty hard. Each year you're going to lose some fruit set if you do that, but they can take the abuse. So if you need to prune them down real low, they will come back. Just don't expect to get a huge load of fruit off of it, because it's going to put a lot of energy into growing back limbs and foliage. When it comes to the tropicals, I really don't do much in the way of pruning. The bamboo, I like to actually thin that out in the fall, just so that I'm not doing everything all at once. But one tropical that I did find that I had to just cut back is my banana. Even though we had really mild winter, bananas do tend to get some damage when you're close to or around frost levels, which we did get a couple nights of that, even though it was brief. All the leaves died back on this Namwa banana. So I have since cut all that off, now that we're basically out of risk for frost. So hopefully this will grow back and potentially flower for me this year and produce bananas. You can see at the bottom there that the two pups actually didn't suffer a whole lot of damage. They're closer to the ground, a little bit more protected. The higher a plant is off the ground, the more damage it can get from frost. The last tree I want to cover is the Royal Poinciana. So back in 2019, I had to really severely prune this tree because it got so badly damaged. I actually thought I'd lose the tree completely. I got infested with boring insects as well. Since then it's come back. We haven't had very low temperatures the last few years, so it's had a chance to put on growth. So with this tree, I left most of the branches. There are very few that actually died back from any kind of cold. What will happen is you'll see them turn a black color. So I just cut those out. The other thing I did too was, just because I want to protect this trunk from sunburn, is went through and just painted up the trunk. And you can see actually that exposed area of the trunk. That's where I had to cut a good portion of the tree off that got frozen back in 2019. So that's really the only other maintenance that I did on this tree. So while I'm not an expert at this, I do these videos just to help you out, show you what works for me in my home garden situation, hoping that you gain some value from it and can use it in your own garden. So hopefully seeing these trees, the after effects of pruning that I do each year, has helped you in some way. Thanks for watching and happy gardening.